The miracle of the feeding of the 5,000 is by far Jesus' greatest miracle in terms of the number of people that were involved. They weren't just spectators or observers of this miracle, but they were actually participants. And the miracle is recorded in all four Gospels. The only other miracle recorded in all four Gospels is the Lord's resurrection. And we're told that there were 5,000 men. We don't know for sure how many women and children. Some Bible scholars have guesstimated, and that's all it is a guess, that there could have been 15,000 total, 20,000. I've even heard as high as 25,000. But the fact of the matter is we don't know. So this miracle is unique because of the number of people involved. The only other miracle that had that many people was a similar miracle, and that was the feeding of the 4,000, which took place on the east side of the Sea of Galilee in an area called Decapolis, and that was 4,000 men. So again, the total would have been much higher. But this miracle, just because of the number of people involved, makes it very unique. And as I said, they were actually participants in this miracle. And it's also a creation miracle, because what we see is, and we see this throughout Jesus' ministry, by the way, but we see Jesus as the creator, because in this miracle, he, of course, is creating food. It's also a clear demonstration of the deity of Christ, which is, by the way, the theme of John's Gospel. In the next to last chapter of John's Gospel, chapter 20, in verses 30 and 31, we read this, and it's an amazing statement. It says, "And truly Jesus did many other signs in the presence of his disciples, which are not written in this book. But these are written that you may believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and that believing you may have life in his name." That's the entire purpose of John's Gospel. So everything that you need to make an informed decision regarding who Jesus was is contained in John's Gospel. And there's more than enough there to not only demonstrate who Jesus was, but who Jesus is, and for you to put your faith and trust in him. And I hope you've done that. If not, perhaps as a result of this account that we're going to look at in this video, you'll consider it if you haven't put your faith and trust in him. But in verse 1, it says, "After these things, Jesus went over the Sea of Galilee, which is the Sea of Tiberias." Interesting, the phrase "after these things," when you look at the other gospel accounts, likely covers a period of over a year. And so quite a bit of time has gone by. Verse 2, it says, "Then a great multitude followed him because they saw his signs which he performed on those who were diseased." This verse explains why there was a large crowd who were following him. Some followed him to hear his teaching, but many people followed him because of the miracles that he was performing. And we can certainly understand that. Jesus was, for example, giving sight to blind people. If you knew someone, or if you were related to someone who was blind, and you heard that this preacher by the name of Jesus of Nazareth was giving sight to blind people, you'd do everything you could to get that loved one or that friend to Jesus. And so at this point in his ministry, thousands and thousands of people were following him because of the signs, the miracles that he performed. And verse 3 says, "And Jesus went up on the mountain, and there he sat with his disciples." I've told the folks at the church where I pastor all the time, this in Jesus' day was the proper position for the one teaching. The teacher would sit and everybody else would stand around. And I've told the folks at our church, when I go a little long some Sunday, just remember that. I've even suggested we should try that some Sunday where I sit and they all stand. They didn't seem to like that idea too much. But we see Jesus here standing, and again, that was the proper position for the one that was teaching. Verse 4 says, "Now the Passover, a feast of the Jews, was near." And this also partly explains the large crowd. In addition to the miracles, which it tells us they were following him because of those things, the feast of the Passover in Jesus' day would draw crowds, we're told, of 250,000 people or more. So again, this would also explain the large crowd. And again, we don't know for sure how large. We know there were 5,000 men. But even if you just doubled that, adding women and children, or triple that, it would be 10 to 15,000, which I think is very likely. It was at least that many. Verse 5, then Jesus lifted up his eyes, and seeing a great multitude coming toward him, he said to Philip, where shall we buy bread that these may eat? This was a big concern back in those days. You didn't have just restaurants or fast foods along the path. And the other three Gospels tell us that it was late in the day, and the area that they were in was out in the middle of nowhere. And so it was a good, number one, it was nighttime. It wasn't safe even back then to travel around at night. Of course, with this large of a number, they would have had some safety in numbers, but still, it was quite a long journey. So this was a great concern. How are we going to feed these people? And it says in verse 6, but this he, that is Jesus, said to test him, for he himself knew what he would do. No surprise here that Jesus knew what he was going to do. He always knew what he was going to do, but he's sort of testing Philip to see what Philip is going to say, how he's going to respond. Verse 7, Philip answered him, 200 denarii worth of bread is not sufficient for them, that every one of them may have a little. A single denarii was the typical wage for a day's work. So 200 denarii would be somewhere between 5 and 6 months' wage. So the point is, it's a lot. And Philip, who's presenting this hypothetical amount, suggesting that, even if we had purchased that much bread, and that would be pretty significant, 5 to 6 months wage to pay just buying bread. He says that wouldn't even be enough for that large of a crowd for everyone to get more than a bite or just a little. So in verse 8, it says, one of his disciples, Andrew, Simon Peter's brother, said to him, there is a lad here who has 5 barley loaves and 2 small fish. But what are they among so many? This amount was actually less than we envision. I've seen pictures where it's like pretty good sized loaves and pretty good sized fish. It was probably more like a small biscuit, or it's even been suggested a cracker. Pretty tiny. And the fish, instead of being a good sized fish, were small and possibly the size of a sardine, if you can, picture how small that is. But even though it wasn't as much as we think, the boy more than likely was given enough to share. And that's one of the things that's sort of interesting that a lot of people never really thought about or realized. Since this would have been considered quite a bit for one boy, he was likely given enough to share. And that's why after they determined the amount that the boy had, they said, but what are they among so many? In other words, he has enough to share, but not with this large of a crowd, which really kind of makes you wonder. Since it doesn't mention the boy's parents, the language would suggest that he may have been by himself, and since his mother did pack him enough to share, I can imagine him getting home and his mother saying, so how many people did you share with? Guarantee you she wasn't prepared for the answer. 5, 10, 15,000 people. But again, the lunch that she packed for him would have been enough to share. That was something they did in that culture. In verse 10, then Jesus said, make the people sit down. Now there was much grass in the place, so the men sat down, in number about 5,000. Again, we're just counting the men here, and the actual total number, as I said, could have been 15 to 25,000. We're not really sure. All 4 Gospels, by the way, record that amount, the 5,000 men. It says in verse 11, and Jesus took the loaves, and when he had given thanks, he distributed them to the disciples, and the disciples to those sitting down, and likewise of the fish, as much as they wanted. On this Thanksgiving Day, when I post this, it's going to be Thanksgiving Day. Not sure if that means a lot of people will watch or nobody will watch, but eventually folks will watch, hopefully, and be blessed by it. But here it says that Jesus gave thanks. We don't know the specific prayer that he prayed. It doesn't tell us. I don't know if you've ever realized this or not, but this is one of the points of this account that I think are interesting. But Jesus was actually giving thanks for something that did not exist when he thanked the Father for it. He hadn't performed this miracle yet, but he's thanking God for it. So something that didn't exist. You've heard the expression, seeing is believing, but actually that's not really true. Seeing is not believing, seeing is knowing. The expression should be believing is seeing, because as I heard one guy say years ago, some things you have to believe before you can see it. And I think that's certainly true. Verse 12, so when they were filled, he said to his disciples, gather up the fragments that remain so that nothing is lost. This is one of the elements of this story that is not often pointed out. But it's important to understand that very few in this crowd, however large they were, again, at least 5,000 men, could have been 10, 15,000, we don't know when you add the women and the children, but very few of those people, if any, had ever experienced being full. All four gospel accounts mention that they were full. And later in this same chapter, after Jesus had walked on water, it says, in verse 25 through 27, and when they found him on the other side of the sea, they said to him, Rabbi, when did you come here? Jesus answered them and said, most assuredly, I say to you, you seek me not because you saw the signs, but because you ate of the loaves and were filled. So even Jesus acknowledges this. You're looking for me because you were full. They had never experienced being full before. He says in verse 27, do not labor for the food which perishes, but for the food which endures to everlasting life, which the Son of Man will give you because God the Father has set his seal on him. So again, these people were full, and there was even scraps left over. And Jesus said to gather those things up. Verse 13, therefore they gathered them up and filled 12 baskets with the fragments of the 5 barley loaves, which were left over by those who had eaten. The Greek word that's translated basket here describes a small basket, what we would probably think of today as a lunchbox. And it's really amazing when you think about it. Each of the disciples, and there were 12, each of them ended up with a lunchbox full of more than they started with. And here's something to sort of think about. Each basket or lunchbox was probably about the size of the container that the little boy started out with. So each one of them ended up with that much. Verse 14, then those men, when they had seen the sign that Jesus did, said, this is truly the prophet who is to come into the world. To say that the crowd was impressed would be an understatement. Look at the next verse, verse 15. Therefore, when Jesus perceived that they were about to come and take him by force to make him king, he departed again to the mountain by himself alone. And as I said, right after this, here in John 6, we have the account where Jesus walks on water. Well, chances are, since you're watching this video and you've watched this far, that you have had a good Thanksgiving and probably plenty of food. Some of us might even be full, I'm sure, on this Thanksgiving day when we're finished eating. But then, we always experience being full. As we celebrate Thanksgiving today, 2024, when I post this video, I encourage you to be thankful, not only for the many blessings that God has bestowed upon us, but thank him just as Jesus did for the blessings that are yet to come. Also pray for those in this world, and there are many who are less fortunate than you and I. And we need to we need to be thankful for what God has given to us. Well, thank you for watching this video. Please like the video, give it a thumbs up, and also share the video with someone else who may be encouraged and blessed by it, and subscribe to the channel. All those things are helpful and lets me know that you would not only appreciate this content, but would like more of it. Once again, thank you so much for visiting The Essential Truth. This is Pastor Dave. You have a blessed day and a happy Thanksgiving.